The September sun shone intensely over the meticulously maintained gardens of the Whitmore Mansion in Greenwich, Connecticut. It was one of those perfect autumn days on the East Coast, when the leaves were beginning to take on golden hues, and the air carried a fresh breeze that promised changes. But inside the imposing colonial-style residence, the atmosphere was far from harmonious. Isabella Whitmore nervously adjusted the pearl necklace that had belonged to her grandmother, while observing her reflection in the antique bedroom mirror. At 28, she possessed the natural elegance that came from generations of refined education. Silky brown hair pulled back in a low chignon, green eyes that reflected determination, and a posture that betrayed years of etiquette lessons. Today, however, there was something different in her gaze, a mixture of nervousness and defiance that didn't go unnoticed. "Isabella, are you absolutely certain about what you're doing?" Margaret Whitmore's voice echoed through the room, laden with concern that bordered on desperation. Her mother, a 55-year-old woman who had dedicated her entire life to maintaining the family's status in Connecticut high society, paced back and forth, her perfectly manicured hands gesticulating dramatically. "Mother, we've talked about this dozens of times," Isabella replied, her voice firm despite the tightness in her chest. "I love Marco and he loves me. That's what matters." Margaret stopped abruptly, turning to face her daughter. "Love?" She practically spat the word. "Isabella, darling, you were raised to understand that marriage is much more than love. It's about social compatibility, financial stability, family connections. This Marco Rossi works in a mechanic shop. His hands are always dirty with grease. So what?" Isabella turned to face her mother, her green eyes flashing. "He's honest, hard-working, treats me like a queen. When was the last time you saw Dad treat you with half the affection Marco shows me?" The silence that followed was cutting. Margaret knew her daughter was right about Charles Whitmore, a man who for years had prioritized his business and golf club above family. But that didn't change the fact that Isabella was about to commit what she considered the biggest mistake of her life. "People will talk, Isabella. Our family has a reputation to uphold. The Whitmores have always married within their social circle. Your great-grandfather was a senator. Your grandfather built a real estate empire. Your father is one of Connecticut's most respected lawyers. And you want to throw all that away for an Italian mechanic?" Isabella closed her eyes for a moment, breathing deeply. She knew this day would come, knew she would have to face not only her family, but all of Greenwich's elite who had watched her grow up. But in the past 2 years, since meeting Marco under circumstances that still made her smile, she had discovered what it truly meant to be loved and respected. "Mother," she said softly, approaching and taking Margaret's hands, "I understand your concerns. I really do. But you don't know Marco like I know him. There's much more to him than meets the eye." Margaret sighed deeply, looking at the daughter who had always been her greatest source of pride, and now of concern. "Isabella, I just want you to be happy and safe. This man, we don't know anything about his family, about his past. He appeared out of nowhere 2 years ago. He didn't appear out of nowhere. He moved here from Boston to start a new life, and as for his family..." Isabella hesitated for a moment. Marco had always been reserved about his past, changing the subject whenever she tried to delve deeper into the topic. "He lost his parents young. He doesn't like talking about it." Downstairs, the first guests were beginning to arrive. Through the window, Isabella could see the luxury cars parking in the circular driveway. Mercedes, BMWs, some Bentleys. Greenwich's elite was present, more out of morbid curiosity than genuine happiness for the couple. She knew many came only to witness what they considered the social downfall of one of the region's most traditional families. "Miss Isabella," the soft voice of Maria, the family's housekeeper for more than 20 years, interrupted the tense moment. "Mr. Marco has arrived. He's in the garden with your father." Isabella felt her heart race. Even after 2 years together, Marco still had this effect on her. There was something about his presence that both calmed and excited her. "How does he look?" she asked, trying to disguise her anxiety. Maria smiled warmly. "Handsome as always, dear, and very nervous. He asked me to tell you he's anxious to see you." Margaret observed her daughter's expression light up and felt a pang in her heart. She really loved that man, that was undeniable. But maternal instinct warned her that there was something she couldn't identify about Marco Rossi. Outside, in the perfectly landscaped garden, Marco Rossi adjusted his tie for the 10th time in 5 minutes. At 32, he possessed a magnetic presence that drew attention wherever he went. Tall, with broad shoulders that betrayed years of physical work, dark hair always perfectly styled, and deep brown eyes that seemed to hold secrets. Today, wearing an impeccably tailored tuxedo, he seemed to belong to that world of luxury, despite his humble origins. Nervous son, Charles Whitmore approached, offering a glass of whiskey. Despite initial reservations about his son-in-law, Charles had developed a grudging respect for Marco. There was something about the young man that inspired confidence, a natural authority he recognized from his years dealing with powerful people. A little, Marco admitted, accepting the drink. His accent carried traces of Boston, but there was something more subtle underneath, something Charles couldn't identify. It's not every day a guy like me marries a princess like Isabella. Charles studied his future son-in-law. Marco, may I ask a personal question? Of course, Mr. Whitmore. Do you really love my daughter? Because if this is some kind of scam... Marco turned to face Charles directly, and for a moment, the experienced lawyer saw something in the young man's eyes that made him instinctively step back. It wasn't a threat, but an intensity that suggested Marco Rossi was not a man to be underestimated. Mr. Whitmore, Marco said, his voice low but firm, I would give my life for Isabella. She's the most precious thing that's ever happened to me. I understand you have doubts about me, about my past, my financial situation, but I can promise one thing. Your daughter will never be disrespected or mistreated while she's with me. There was something in the way he said it that made Charles believe completely. These weren't just words. It was a promise sealed with something much deeper than simple romantic love. Guests continued arriving, and Marco could feel the curious and, in many cases, disdainful looks. He knew this type of people. He had grown up observing them from afar, learning their habits, their weaknesses. But today, he was on the inside, about to become one of them through marriage. Marco! The familiar voice made him turn. His best friend and best man, Tony Benedetto, approached with a broad smile. Tony was the only link to his past that Marco had allowed in his new life. And even then, he had established strict rules about what could or couldn't be discussed. Tony, you made it on time, Marco said, embracing his friend. Tony was a robust 35-year-old man, with the kind of presence that made people instinctively step away. Today, however, he was trying to blend in, wearing an expensive suit and keeping his manners as refined as possible. Wouldn't miss this for anything in the world, brother. Are you sure you're ready for this? This life? It's very different from what we're used to. Marco looked around, observing Greenwich's elite in their expensive attire, talking about investments and trips to Europe. It's exactly what I want, Tony. Isabella makes me want to be a better man. And the business? The boys are asking. Business continues as always, Marco interrupted, his voice low but firm. But now I have a double life to maintain. Isabella can't know anything. Never. Tony nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. Understood, boss? But you know you can't keep this up forever, right? Eventually I'll figure it out. Marco cut off the conversation. Today is about Isabella and our future together. Meanwhile, in the mansion's main hall, guests gathered in small groups, their conversations inevitably revolving around the unusual wedding they were about to witness. I simply can't understand, murmured Priscilla Vanderberg, one of the local society matriarchs, to a group of equally shocked women. Isabella has always been so sensible. How can she throw away everything she has for a laborer? I heard he doesn't even have a college education, added Eleanor Ashford, shaking her head disapprovingly. Margaret must be mortified. Well, said Victoria Sterling, always ready to add drama to any situation, maybe she's pregnant. It would be the only logical explanation for this madness. The women exchanged glances, considering the possibility. In their minds, It was the only way to justify why a Whitmore would lower herself to marry someone so far below her social class. On the other side of the hall, the men had their own theories. "He must be very good in bed," commented Richard Pemberton, provoking muffled laughter from the group. "These Italians know how to satisfy a woman." "Careful, Richard," warned James Morrison, a banker who had known the Whitmore family for decades. "Charles may be liberal about many things, but not when it comes to disrespecting his daughter." "I just hope the boy knows what he's getting into," said another. Marrying a Whitmore comes with expectations. Isabella is accustomed to a certain standard of living. While guests speculated, Isabella made final preparations. Her wedding dress was a work of art, Italian silk with delicate embroidery, a classic design that enhanced her natural elegance. It had belonged to her grandmother and had been carefully altered to fit perfectly. "You look beautiful, dear," said Margaret, finally yielding to the inevitable. She had spent the last months trying to dissuade her daughter, but now, seeing Isabella radiant with happiness, she was beginning to accept that perhaps, just perhaps, her daughter knew what she was doing. "Thank you, Mother. That means a lot to me." Margaret held her daughter's hands. "Isabella, I may not understand your choice, but I love you, and if Marco makes you happy, then I'll try to accept that." Tears formed in Isabella's eyes. "He makes me very happy, Mother. You'll see." The sound of music began playing downstairs, signaling that the ceremony was about to begin. Isabella breathed deeply, looked at herself in the mirror one last time, and prepared to descend the stairs that would lead her to a new life. As she walked down the hallway, she had no idea she was about to marry one of the most dangerous men on the East Coast, someone whose influence extended far beyond Hartford's mechanic shops. Marco Rossi wasn't just a passionate mechanic. He was the head of one of New England's most powerful criminal families, a man who had built an empire in the shadows while maintaining a facade of simplicity. And today, he was about to add social legitimacy to his power by marrying the daughter of one of Connecticut's most respected families. What Isabella didn't know was that her marriage for love was about to become the most dangerous and powerful union Greenwich had ever witnessed. The music swelled, guests stood up, and Isabella Whitmore began her walk toward a future that would be much more complex and dangerous than she could ever imagine. 3 weeks after the wedding that had been the most talked about topic in Greenwich, Isabella and Marco returned from their honeymoon in Tuscany. The trip had been a dream. Family wineries, romantic dinners under the stars, walks through the golden hills of the region. Marco had shown himself to be surprisingly knowledgeable about Italian culture, speaking the language fluently and navigating local traditions as if he had been born there. "How do you know so much about wine?" Isabella had asked one evening, while they tasted a 1995 Brunello di Montalcino at a family restaurant in Siena. Marco had smiled, that mysterious smile she was learning to recognize. "My nonno taught me when I was a child. He always said that a man who doesn't understand wine doesn't understand life." It was always like that, small glimpses of a past that Marco kept carefully guarded, as if each memory were a treasure he carefully rationed. Now, back in Hartford, Connecticut, they were settled in a modest but comfortable house that Marco had bought in the West End neighborhood. It was a stark contrast to the Whitmore mansion, but Isabella had insisted she wanted to build her own life, away from the constant judgment of Greenwich's elite. "Are you sure you don't want to accept my father's offer?" Isabella asked while they unpacked souvenirs from the trip. Charles had offered to buy a larger house for the couple in a more prestigious neighborhood, but Marco had politely refused. "Bella," Marco used the affectionate nickname he had adopted during the honeymoon, "I want us to build our life with our own effort. It means more that way." Isabella smiled, admiring her husband's integrity. It was one of the things she loved most about him, his refusal to accept shortcuts or favors he hadn't earned. What she didn't know was that the modest house was just a facade. Marco had chosen that location strategically. It was only 15 minutes from his true center of operations, a discreet warehouse in Hartford's industrial district that served as headquarters for his less legal activities. The next morning, Marco kissed Isabella before leaving for work. "I'll be a little late today. We have a special client at the shop." "That's fine, love." I'll take the opportunity to better organize the house. Marco drove his Ford F-150 pickup through Hartford's familiar streets, but instead of heading to the mechanic shop where he officially worked, he took a different route. 20 minutes later, he was parking in front of an apparently abandoned industrial building in the city's East Zone. "Boss!" Tony Benedetto greeted him at the entrance, his expression serious, contrasting with the jovial humor he had shown at the wedding. "We have problems." Marco immediately changed posture. The gentle and passionate man who had kissed Isabella goodbye disappeared, replaced by someone with a cold and calculating authority. "What kind of problems?" "The Irish are testing our limits. Mickey O'Sullivan is moving product in our territory, and when Sal went to talk to him, shots were almost fired." Marco walked through the warehouse, where a dozen men worked on various activities, some counting money, others organizing merchandise, all stopping to greet him respectfully. This was his real world, an empire he had carefully built over the last 10 years. "Where's Sal now?" "In the hospital. Took a beating, but he'll be fine. The problem is O'Sullivan is spreading word that we're weak, that marriage has made you soft." Marco stopped abruptly, his eyes darkening. "Is that so?" Tony knew that tone. He had grown up with Marco on Boston's streets, had seen the transformation from orphaned boy to the feared man standing before him. "Boss, maybe it's time to send a clear message. Set up a meeting tonight. I want O'Sullivan and his lieutenants at Pier 47, midnight. And if they don't show..." Marco smiled, but there was no warmth in that smile. "They'll show. Nobody ignores an invitation from me twice." While Marco dealt with problems in his criminal empire, Isabella was discovering intriguing aspects of her new life. She had decided to shop in downtown Hartford and was surprised by people's reaction to her husband's name. "Rossi?" the Italian delicatessen owner had repeated when she mentioned the surname. "Are you family to Marco?" "I'm his wife." The man, an Italian of about 60, immediately changed his attitude. "Madonna mia, Signora Rossi, please, sit down. I'll prepare something special for you." Isabella was confused by the almost reverential treatment, but attributed it to traditional Italian hospitality. What she didn't notice were the discreet phone calls the owner made after she left, spreading the news that the capo's wife was in the area. Later, while walking through downtown, Isabella noticed other strange signs. Men in expensive cars greeted her respectfully. Merchants offered to carry her purchases, and there was a general deference she couldn't explain. "Maybe it's because I'm new in the neighborhood," she thought, but part of her was beginning to suspect there was something more. That night, Marco arrived home later than usual, looking tense. Isabella was preparing dinner. She had decided to learn to cook Italian dishes to surprise her husband. "How was your day?" she asked, noticing the stiffness in his shoulders. "Complicated, problems with suppliers." Marco kissed her, but Isabella noticed he was distracted. "And you? How was exploring Hartford?" "Interesting. People were very kind to me, especially when I mentioned I'm your wife." Marco froze for a moment. "Really?" "Yes. Mr. Benedetti at the delicatessen almost treated me like royalty, and several people on the street seemed to know me, even though they'd never seen me before." Marco forced a smile. "Italian community is like that, very close-knit. When you become part of the family, everyone takes care of you." Isabella nodded, but something about the explanation didn't completely convince her. There was an intensity in how people reacted to the Rossi name that went beyond simple ethnic camaraderie. After dinner, while Isabella showered, Marco made a series of discreet phone calls. "Tony, I need you to spread the word. My wife cannot be exposed to anything related to business. Nothing. If anyone talks too much around her, they'll have to answer to me personally." "Understood, boss. But you know you can't keep this up forever, right? She's smart. Eventually she'll start asking harder questions." "I know. But for now she needs to be protected from this." At 11:30 p.m., Marco kissed Isabella, who was already sleeping, and quietly left the house. She woke briefly, hearing the sound of the car driving away, but went back to sleep, assuming he had been called for an emergency at the shop. In reality, Marco was heading to the most important meeting of his criminal career since taking control of the family. Mickey O'Sullivan had accepted the invitation, but Marco knew it would be a delicate negotiation. The Irish had controlled a significant part of Hartford's drug trafficking for years, and any open conflict could draw unwanted attention from authorities. Pier 47 was shrouded in fog when Marco arrived, accompanied by Tony and 4 other trusted men. On the other side, Mickey O'Sullivan waited with his own group, hard men with scars that told stories of violence. "Rossi," Mickey greeted, his voice laden with barely disguised contempt. "I heard you married a little princess. Must be making you soft." Marco walked slowly toward the Irishman, his hands relaxed at his sides, but his men knew how to recognize the signs. When Marco became too calm, it was time to worry. "Mickey," Marco said softly, "you're operating in my territory. That stops today." "Your territory?" Mickey laughed, but there was nervousness in his voice. "Since when are the docks Italian territory?" "Since I decided they are." Marco stopped a few meters from Mickey. "You have 2 options. You can accept working under my rules, paying the appropriate percentage, or you can find new territory, far away from here. And if I choose a 3rd option?" Marco smiled, and Mickey felt a chill run down his spine. "There is no 3rd option." What happened in the next 15 minutes at Pier 47 would become legend on Hartford streets. Without firing a single shot, Marco Rossi managed not only to neutralize the Irish threat, but also significantly expand his territory and influence. Mickey O'Sullivan left there clearly understanding that he had gravely underestimated the man many considered just a mechanic married to a socialite. When Marco arrived home at 3 a.m., Isabella was sleeping deeply. He took a long shower, washing away any trace of the night, and carefully slipped into bed beside his wife. Isabella stirred, half awake. "Everything okay, love? Everything resolved, Bella. Go back to sleep." She snuggled against him, and Marco embraced her, feeling the contrast between her innocence and the darkness of his world. In that moment, he made a silent promise. He would do anything to protect Isabella from the truth about who he really was, even if it meant living a lie for the rest of his life. But secrets have a way of coming to light, especially when living in 2 such different realities. And Isabella Rossi was about to discover that her perfect husband kept secrets that could destroy not only their marriage, but her own life. The next morning, while Marco slept deeply after the intense night, Isabella received a phone call that would change everything. "Mrs. Rossi?" The voice was female, nervous. "My name is Sarah Chen. I'm a reporter with the Hartford Courant. I'd like to ask some questions about your husband." Isabella frowned. "Questions about Marco? Why?" "Well, we're investigating some suspicious activities in the industrial district, and his name came up in our investigation. Would you have a few minutes to talk?" Isabella's heart began to beat faster. "What kind of suspicious activities?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Perhaps it would be better if we talked in person. Could you meet me this afternoon?" Isabella looked at Marco, who was still sleeping, and felt for the first time since the wedding a real pang of doubt about the man she had married. "Yes," she said finally, "I can." The Blue State Coffee in downtown Hartford was moderately busy that October afternoon. Isabella arrived 15 minutes before the scheduled time, choosing a corner table where she could observe the entrance. Her hands trembled slightly as she stirred the latte she had ordered, her mind full of questions she couldn't properly formulate. Sarah Chen was an Asian American woman of about 35, with black hair pulled back in a ponytail and thin-framed glasses that gave her an intellectual air. When she entered the cafe, her eyes immediately found Isabella. It wasn't hard to identify a Whitmore, even now as a Rossi. "Mrs. Rossi?" Sarah approached cautiously, carrying a leather briefcase and a digital recorder. "Thank you for agreeing to meet me." Isabella gestured to the chair across from her. "Please sit down. But before we begin, I need to know exactly what we're talking about. You mentioned suspicious activities?" Sarah settled in, studying Isabella carefully. There was something in the young wife's expression that suggested genuine ignorance about her husband's activities. "Mrs. Rossi, how long have you known your husband?" 2 years. We've been married for a month." Isabella answered automatically, but then frowned. "Why is this relevant? And what has he told you about his past?" His family? His previous business? Isabella felt growing discomfort. He lost his parents young. He came from Boston to start a new life. He works as a mechanic. Each word sounded weaker than the last, as if she were trying to convince herself. Sarah opened her briefcase and pulled out a series of photographs. "Mrs. Rossi, do you recognize any of these people?" Isabella examined the photos. The first showed Marco leaving a building that was definitely not a mechanic shop, wearing an expensive suit and accompanied by intimidating-looking men. The second showed him at a restaurant table with individuals she didn't recognize, but who seemed to be in a serious business meeting. The third, "Oh my God," Isabella murmured, recognizing Tony Benedetto in the photo, but not the jovial Tony from the wedding. This Tony had a hard expression, was clearly armed, and walked beside Marco like a bodyguard. "These photos were taken in the last 6 months," Sarah explained gently. "Your husband isn't just a mechanic, Mrs. Rossi. Our investigations suggest he's involved in organized criminal activities." Isabella felt the world spin around her. "That's impossible. Marco he's gentle, honest, hardworking." "I'm sure he's all those things with you," Sarah said with genuine compassion. "But there's substantial evidence that Marco Rossi is much more than he appears. Did you know he owns properties worth more than $2 million? That he has bank accounts in 3 different states? That men known for criminal activities treat him with almost feudal deference?" Isabella shook her head, trying to process the information. "No, this can't be right. If he had so much money, why would we live in a modest house? Why would he work in a shop?" "That's an excellent question," Sarah agreed, "and one only he can answer." The 2 women sat in silence for a few moments. Isabella stared fixedly at the photographs, trying to reconcile the man she loved with the evidence before her. "What exactly do you suspect he does?" she finally asked. Sarah hesitated. "Money laundering, extortion, possibly drug trafficking. There are rumors that he took control of criminal operations that previously belonged to the Torino family from Boston." "Torino family?" Isabella repeated the name, feeling a vague memory forming. "I've heard that name before. They were one of New England's most powerful criminal families until about 5 years ago, when the patriarch, Vincent Torino, died under mysterious circumstances. After that, the organization fragmented, but there are indications that someone reunified the operations under new leadership." Isabella stood abruptly. "I need to go." "Mrs. Rossi, I understand this is shocking, but—" "You understand." Isabella turned, her green eyes blazing with a mixture of anger and pain. "You understand what it's like to discover your entire life might be a lie? That the man you love might be a criminal?" Sarah also stood, extending a business card. "If you want to talk more, or if you discover something that might help our investigation, please call me. And Mrs. Rossi, be careful. If our suspicions are correct, your husband is a very dangerous man." Isabella took the card with trembling hands and left the cafe without looking back. She drove home on autopilot, her mind a whirlwind of contradictory emotions. Part of her wanted to dismiss everything as a misunderstanding, but the photographs were undeniable. And now that the seeds of doubt had been planted, small details she had ignored began to make sense. The way Marco always paid in cash, his surprising knowledge of expensive wines and refined culture for someone who supposedly grew up poor, the deference he received from strangers, the late-night phone calls he always answered in another room. When she got home, Marco hadn't returned from work yet. Isabella walked through the house she had begun to consider her home, but now everything seemed different, as if she were seeing through a distorted lens. She went up to the bedroom they shared, and for the first time since the wedding, began searching for evidence. She didn't know exactly what she was looking for, but felt she needed to find something that would prove Sarah Chen was wrong. In Marco's closet, behind his work clothes, she found 3 expensive suits she had never seen him wear. In the pocket of one of them, a business card from an exclusive restaurant in Boston. In his nightstand, under some papers, a key she didn't recognize. The sound of Marco's pickup in the garage made her freeze. Quickly, she put everything back in place and went downstairs, trying to appear normal. "Hi, Bella," Marco greeted her with his usual smile. but Isabella noticed he seemed more tense than normal. "How was your day?" "Fine," she lied, forcing a smile. "And yours?" "Complicated. We had to deal with some supplier problems." Marco kissed her, but Isabella pulled away slightly, something he noticed immediately. "Everything okay?" "Yes, I'm just a little tired." Marco studied her for a moment. In his years leading a criminal organization, he had developed a keen instinct for detecting when something was wrong. "Are you sure? You seem different." Isabella felt her heart race. "Different how?" "I don't know. Distant." Marco approached, placing his hands on her shoulders. "Bella, you know you can tell me anything, right?" The irony of the statement almost made her laugh bitterly. "Of course. Just like you tell me everything." There was a moment of tense silence. Marco tilted his head, his eyes darkening slightly. "What does that mean?" Isabella breathed deeply, deciding to test the waters. "Marco, have you told me everything about your past? About your family, your previous business?" "Why are you asking that?" "Just curiosity. Sometimes I feel like there's so much about you I don't know." Marco stepped away, walking to the window. "Bella, my past isn't important. What matters is our future together." "But it's important to me," Isabella insisted, her voice gaining strength. "We're married, Marco. There shouldn't be secrets between us." Marco turned to face her, and for a moment Isabella saw something in his eyes that made her instinctively step back. It wasn't anger, but a calculating coldness she had never seen before. "Everyone has secrets, Isabella. Even you. What secrets would I have? Have you told me about all the men you were involved with before me? About all the conversations you had with your friends about our marriage? About all the doubts you had about marrying me?" Isabella fell silent, realizing he had skillfully deflected the conversation. "See?" Marco approached again. But now there was something predatory in his movements. "We all have parts of ourselves we keep private. That doesn't mean we don't love each other." That night during dinner, Isabella observed Marco with new eyes. She noticed how he cut meat with surgical precision, how his eyes constantly checked windows and doors, how he kept his phone always within reach. Small details she had previously attributed to personal habits now seemed sinister. "Marco," she said casually, "do you know anyone named Vincent Torino?" Marco stopped chewing. For a fraction of a second, his mask slipped, and Isabella saw something that terrified her. Recognition, and perhaps even pain. "Where did you hear that name?" His voice was low, dangerous. I don't remember. Maybe I heard it somewhere." Isabella tried to sound unconcerned, but knew she had failed. Marco put his fork on the plate and leaned forward. "Isabella, that's not a name you should know. And it's definitely not a name you should be repeating." "Why? Who was he?" "He was a very dangerous man who died a few years ago, and anyone associated with him was also dangerous." Marco took her hand across the table, but his touch wasn't comforting. "Promise me you won't mention that name again." "Marco, you're scaring me." "Good," he said, his eyes never leaving hers. "Maybe you should be scared. There are people in this world who are very different from what they seem, Isabella. People who can be loving and gentle with their families, but ruthless with their enemies." Isabella felt a chill run down her spine. "What are you talking about?" Marco released her hand and leaned back in his chair. "I'm talking about the importance of not asking questions about things you don't understand, about trusting your husband when he says some things are better left in the past." The rest of dinner passed in tense silence. Isabella could barely eat, her mind processing the subtle but terrifying transformation she had witnessed. The gentle and passionate man she knew had momentarily disappeared, replaced by someone cold and threatening. Later, while Marco showered, Isabella took Sarah Chen's card and hid it in her purse. She needed answers and was beginning to realize she wouldn't get them from her husband. When Marco came out of the bathroom, he found Isabella already in bed, pretending to sleep. He lay down beside her, but Isabella could feel he was awake, thoughtful. "Bella," he murmured in the dark, "I love you more than my own life. Everything I do is to protect us, to protect our future. You need to trust me." Isabella kept her eyes closed, but a tear rolled down her face. For the first time since she had met him, she was afraid of the man she loved, and Marco lying in the dark beside his wife, knew his carefully constructed world was beginning to crumble. He had seen the fear in Isabella's eyes, had felt her hesitation. Someone had planted seeds of doubt in her mind, and he needed to find out who. The next morning, while Isabella pretended to sleep, Marco made a series of discreet phone calls. In a few hours, he would know exactly who had spoken to his wife and what had been said. And then, he would have to make a decision that could destroy both his marriage and his life. How far was he willing to go to protect his secrets? Isabella woke the next morning with an iron determination she hadn't felt in weeks. Marco had already left for work, leaving only a loving note on the kitchen table. "Bella, I need to handle some matters today. I love you. M." The words that would have made her smile before now seemed loaded with hidden meanings. She picked up the phone and dialed Sarah Chen's number. "Sarah, it's Isabella Rossi. I need to know everything, absolutely everything you've discovered about my husband." 2 hours later, Isabella was sitting in Sarah's makeshift office at the Hartford Courant, surrounded by files, photographs, and documents that painted a completely different portrait of the man she had married. "Marco Rossi isn't his real name," Sarah began, organizing the papers before her. "He was born Marco Antonio Torino, only son of Vincent Torino, the head of Boston's most powerful criminal family, until his death in 2019. Isabella felt the blood freeze in her veins. Torino, like Vincent Torino? Exactly. Marco didn't just know Vincent Torino. He was his son and designated heir. Sarah showed an old photograph of a young Marco, maybe 22 years old, beside an older man of imposing appearance. When Vincent died under suspicious circumstances, officially a heart attack but many suspect poisoning, Marco disappeared for almost 2 years. And then he resurfaced here in Hartford with a new identity and systematically began rebuilding his father's empire. Only this time, more subtly, more intelligently. Sarah opened another file. He doesn't use unnecessary violence like his father did. Instead, he uses intelligence, strategy, and when necessary, psychological intimidation. Isabella studied the more recent photographs. Marco in meetings with men she now recognized as organized crime figures, entering and leaving establishments that served as fronts for illegal operations, always impeccably dressed and clearly in command. "How much money does he have?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper. "Conservatively, between $15 and $20 million. Properties in 5 states, legitimate investments that serve to launder dirty money, and a network of loyalty that extends from Boston to New York." Isabella leaned back in her chair, feeling physically sick. So everything was a lie. Our meeting, our dating, our marriage? Not necessarily, Sarah said gently. All evidence suggests he really fell in love with you. In fact, this created problems within his own organization. Some of his lieutenants questioned his decision to marry someone from outside their world. "How do you know this?" Sarah hesitated. "We have a source inside the organization, someone willing to testify in exchange for federal protection." Isabella felt a pang of something she couldn't identify. Was it relief knowing Marco really loved her, or terror realizing the depth of his dishonesty? "There's more," Sarah continued. "Last night after our conversation, Marco made several calls. Our source informed us that he discovered our meeting." Isabella's blood ran cold. "How?" "He has people watching you, Isabella. Not constantly, but enough to know where you go and who you talk to. He knows you were with me." Isabella stood abruptly, beginning to pace back and forth. "I need to confront him. I need to hear the truth from his mouth." "Isabella, no." Sarah also stood, clearly alarmed. "You don't understand the danger you're in. Marco may love you, but he's a man who has killed people to protect his secrets. If he thinks you represent a threat, he wouldn't hurt me," Isabella said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Are you sure of that?" "Absolutely sure." Sarah took a final folder. "Because we have evidence of at least 3 people who disappeared after discovering too much about Marco's operations." Isabella stopped walking, staring at Sarah. "Are you saying my husband is a murderer?" "I'm saying your husband is the head of a criminal organization that didn't reach power by being gentle with its enemies." At that moment, Isabella's phone rang. It was Marco. "Bella? Where are you?" Isabella looked at Sarah, who shook her head vigorously. "I'm shopping downtown." "What kind of shopping?" There was something in his voice that made her hesitate. "Clothes. Why?" "Just wanted to make sure you're okay. Come home soon, okay? We need to talk." The call ended and Isabella looked at the phone with growing apprehension. "He knows," Sarah said simply. "Isabella, you need to leave town. Now." "I can't just run away. He's my husband. He's a criminal who discovered his wife is investigating his illegal activities." Sarah took a folder and handed it to Isabella. "Here are copies of everything we have. If something happens to me, give this to the FBI." Isabella took the folder with trembling hands. "Do you think he would really hurt me? I think a man who built a criminal empire didn't get where he is by being sentimental about threats to his security, even if that threat is his own wife." Isabella left Sarah's office in shock, driving home on autopilot. Her mind was a whirlwind of contradictory emotions: love, betrayal, fear, anger. The man who had sworn to love and protect her was a dangerous stranger, and she was about to confront him. When she arrived home, Marco's pickup was already in the garage. She breathed deeply, hid the folder in her car's trunk, and entered the house. Marco was in the living room, sitting in his favorite armchair, but there was something different about his posture. He didn't get up to greet her as he always did. Instead, he just watched her with an expression she had never seen before. "How was shopping?" he asked, his voice dangerously calm. "Fine," Isabella replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "I didn't find anything I liked." "Interesting, because I called 3 stores downtown, and none of them remember seeing you today." Isabella felt her heart race, but forced herself to stay calm. "Maybe they didn't notice me." Marco stood slowly, and Isabella realized he seemed bigger, more intimidating than she remembered. "Isabella, let's try again. Where were you today?" "I told you." "You were with a reporter named Sarah Chen," Marco interrupted, his voice cutting like a blade. "You talked about me." Isabella instinctively stepped back. "Marco, don't lie to me." The explosion was sudden and terrifying. The gentleman she knew completely disappeared, replaced by someone who radiated cold and dangerous authority. "I know exactly where you were, who you talked to, and what you discussed." Isabella felt tears forming in her eyes. "Then you know I know the truth." Marco stopped, studying her. "And what truth would that be? That you're not who you said you were? That you're Marco Torino, not Marco Rossi? That you're the head of a criminal organization? That our entire life together was built on lies?" The silence that followed was deafening. Marco walked to the window, looking outside for a long moment before turning to face her. "You're right," he said simply, "about everything." Isabella had prepared for denials, for more lies. The direct admission left her speechless. "My name is Marco Antonio Torino. My father was Vincent Torino, and yes, I took control of his operations after he died." Marco approached her, but Isabella stepped back. "But there's one thing Sarah Chen didn't tell you, because she doesn't know." "What?" "I fell in love with you before I even knew who you were. Our first meeting wasn't planned, Isabella. It was destiny." Isabella shook her head. "How can I believe anything you say now?" "Because," Marco said, stopping a few meters from her, "if I wanted to use you or hurt you, I would have done it long ago. Do you think it was coincidence I chose to live in a modest house, work in a shop? I did that because I wanted a normal life with you. I wanted to be the man you deserve." "But you're not that man," Isabella screamed, tears finally overflowing. "You're a criminal. You hurt people." "Yes," Marco admitted without hesitation, "I am. And yes, I hurt people when necessary. But I've never hurt an innocent person, and I would never hurt you." "How can I be sure of that?" Marco approached closer, and this time Isabella didn't step back. "Because you're the only good thing in my life, Isabella. The only pure thing. I would kill anyone who tried to hurt you, including members of my own organization." Isabella stared at him, seeing for the first time the complete man, not just the gentle husband or the dangerous criminal, but both existing in the same person. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now," Marco said, You have a choice to make. You can leave, go back to your family. Pretend none of this happened, I won't stop you. And the other option? Marco took her hands, and Isabella noticed they were trembling slightly. The other option is to stay with me, knowing exactly who I am. But if you choose to stay, there can be no more secrets between us. You'll know everything, the good and the terrible. Isabella looked into the eyes of the man she loved and feared in equal measure. And if I choose to stay, but can't handle the truth, then we'll figure it out together, Marco said. But Isabella, you need to understand one thing. If you stay, if you truly become part of my world, there's no going back. There are people who will want to use you against me, people who will try to hurt you to get to me. I can protect you, but your life will never be simple again. Isabella closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the decision. When she opened them again, there was a new determination in her gaze. I want to know everything, she said. Every detail, every secret, every dark part of your life. And then I'll decide if I can live with it. Marco nodded slowly. Then sit down, Bella, because this is going to be a very long conversation. And as the sun set over Hartford, Marco Torino began telling his wife the complete story of who he really was. A story of blood, power, loyalty, and love that would forever change how Isabella saw the world and her place in it. The conversation lasted until the early hours of the morning. Marco told everything, from his childhood on Boston streets, watching his father build an empire through violence and intimidation, to the moment he took control after Vincent's suspicious death. He described the difficult decisions he had made, the people he had eliminated to protect his organization, and how he had spent 2 years meticulously planning his transformation from Marco Torino to Marco Rossi. Isabella listened in silence, occasionally asking questions that revealed the sharp intelligence Marco had always admired. She didn't cry, didn't scream, didn't judge him. She simply absorbed every word, every confession, every dark revelation about the man she loved. "How many people have you killed?" she asked when he finished, her voice surprisingly steady. Marco looked at her directly. "Personally, 7. All were direct threats to my life or the organization. I ordered the deaths of 12 others over the years. And do you feel remorse?" Marco considered the question carefully. "For the innocents who may have been affected, yes. For the men who chose to live in this world and accepted its consequences, no." Isabella stood and walked to the window, watching the dawn paint the sky in pink hues. "Sarah Chen said you have people watching me." "Had," Marco corrected. "For your protection, not to spy on you. But after yesterday, I increased security. There are people who now know you know the truth about me." "What kind of people?" "Rivals who would like to see me dead, federal authorities who would like to see me in prison, and members of my own organization who question whether you represent a security risk." Isabella turned to face him. "They want to kill me?" "Some, yes. Others want to use you as leverage against me." Marco stood, approaching her. "That's why your decision is so important, Bella. If you choose to leave, I can protect you from a distance, ensure you have a safe life away from all this. But if you choose to stay, if I choose to stay, then you become my queen, but also my most vulnerable point, and I'll have to teach you to live in this world." Isabella looked at his hands, noticing for the first time small scars she had never questioned. What would that mean exactly? It would mean learning to recognize threats, to protect yourself, to understand the unwritten rules of my world. It would mean accepting that sometimes I'll have to do terrible things to keep us safe, and it would mean you could never be completely innocent again. Marco's phone rang, interrupting the moment. He answered with a dry, "Yes," listened for a few seconds, and his expression darkened. "Understood. Hold position." He hung up and looked at Isabella. "We have problems." "What kind of problems?" "Sarah Chen was found dead in her apartment an hour ago. Apparently suicide, but..." Isabella felt her blood run cold. "But you don't believe that. Sarah Chen was about to publish a story that could destroy not only my organization, but several others. Someone silenced her before that could happen. Was it you?" The question came out before Isabella could stop herself. Marco stared at her with a hurt expression. No, but I can understand why you would think that. He picked up the phone again. Tony, I need you to come here. Now. 15 minutes later, Tony Benedetto was in the living room. But this wasn't the jovial man Isabella had met at the wedding. This Tony was clearly armed, alert, and treated Marco with a deference that bordered on reverence. Boss, the situation is complicated, Tony began, then looked at Isabella. Can she hear this? She can hear everything, Marco replied firmly. Isabella, this is Tony Benedetto, my right-hand man and best friend since childhood. Tony nodded respectfully to Isabella. Mrs. Torino. Rossi, Isabella corrected automatically, then stopped. Actually, I don't know what my name is anymore. Your name is whatever you choose it to be, Marco said softly. But Tony is right. If you stay, you'll be Isabella Torino, wife of the head of the Torino family. Tony continued his report. The reporter's death wasn't our work, but the feds will assume it was. They're preparing search and seizure warrants. We have maybe 6 hours before they get here. And the other problems? Mickey O'Sullivan is spreading word that you've gone soft because of the marriage. He's trying to form an alliance with the Russians to take you down. And Tony hesitated, looking at Isabella. Speak, Marco ordered. Some of our own men are questioning whether Isabella represents a security risk. There's talk about solving the problem. Isabella felt the world spin around her. They want to kill me. They want to eliminate what they see as a weakness in leadership, Tony explained. In our world, family can be a strength or a vulnerability. It depends on how you handle it. Marco turned to Isabella, his eyes intense. That's why your decision has to be made now, Bella. If you stay, I'm going to have to prove you're not a weakness. And that might mean doing things that will shock you. What kind of things? The kind of things a boss does to maintain respect and control. Isabella looked between Marco and Tony, finally understanding the magnitude of the situation. It wasn't just about accepting Marco's past. It was about becoming an active part of his dangerous world. If I stay, she said slowly, what happens to my family? My parents? They come under my protection, Marco replied. Nobody touches Isabella Torino's family. And if I leave, you get a new identity, a new life in another state, and discreet protection for the rest of your life. But we'll never see each other again. Isabella closed her eyes, feeling the weight of a decision that would change not only her life, but potentially the lives of everyone around her. When she opened them, there was an iron determination in her gaze that surprised even Marco. I'm staying, she said firmly, but with conditions. Marco raised an eyebrow. What conditions? First, no more lies, never again. If you're going to do something terrible, I want to know beforehand, not find out after. Second, my family stays completely out of this. They can never know the truth about you. And third, she hesitated, then continued with a firm voice. I want to learn to defend myself. If I'm going to live in this world, I won't be a helpless victim. Tony looked at Marco with something that seemed like admiration. She's got courage, boss. Marco smiled for the first time in hours. Yes, she does. He approached Isabella, taking her hands. Are you sure, Bella? Because once you fully enter this world, there's no going back. I'm sure, Isabella replied, surprising herself with her own conviction. But Marco, if you ever lie to me again, if you betray me in any way, I'm leaving, and there won't be a second chance. Understood, Marco said, kissing her hands. Welcome to my world, Isabella Torino. Tony cleared his throat. Boss, we need to move. The feds. Right. Marco turned to Isabella. Your first lesson starts now. We're leaving Hartford for a few days until things calm down. You're going to see our safe house in the mountains, and I'm going to start teaching you how our organization works. And Sarah Chen? We're going to find out who killed her, Marco promised, his voice loaded with lethal coldness. And when we do, they're going to pay. 2 hours later, Isabella was in the passenger seat of an armored SUV, watching Hartford disappear in the rearview mirror. Beside her, Marco spoke on the phone in Italian, coordinating movements she was beginning to understand, were much more complex than she had imagined. "Nervous?" he asked when he finished the call. "Terrified," Isabella admitted, "but also strangely excited. It's like I'm finally seeing the real world for the first time." Marco smiled. "The real world is much more complicated than Greenwich's elite imagines, Bella, but it's also much more interesting." As they drove through Connecticut's mountains toward an uncertain future, Isabella reflected on how her life had completely changed in a matter of weeks. She had started as a privileged socialite, married to a humble mechanic. Now she was the wife of the head of a criminal organization, about to learn secrets that could destroy lives. But for the first time since discovering the truth about Marco, she felt complete. There were no more lies between them, no more masks. It was terrifying and liberating at the same time. "Marco," she said when they reached the safe house, an isolated mansion in the mountains that was much more luxurious than anything they had shared as a couple. "I love you. The real man, not the persona you created." Marco stopped the car and looked at her. "Even knowing everything I've done, everything I might still have to do?" "Especially knowing that," Isabella replied, "because now I know that when you chose to love me, you chose to love someone who could destroy you, and that means your love is real." Marco kissed her then, and Isabella knew she had made the right decision. Her life would be dangerous, complicated, and sometimes terrifying, but it would be real, and it would be hers. The ballroom of the Fairmont Copley Plaza in Boston was filled with New England's elite. It was the annual charity event of the Whitmore Foundation, and Isabella Torino, she had officially changed her name, was radiant in a navy blue gown that cost more than most people earned in a year. "You look beautiful tonight, Mrs. Torino," commented the governor of Massachusetts, who had made a point of greeting her personally. "Thank you, Governor. It's a pleasure to see you again." From across the room, Marco watched his wife work the crowd with a natural elegance that made him proud. In the past 6 months, Isabella had transformed into something he had never expected. Not just the wife of a crime boss, but a true partner in his business. She had learned quickly, very quickly. Isabella had discovered she had a natural talent for reading people, for identifying threats, and for using her social position as a powerful tool. Her contacts in high society had become invaluable for Marco's money laundering operations, and her sharp intelligence had helped solve several strategic problems. "She's impressive," commented Tony, approaching Marco. "Who would have thought a Greenwich princess would become one of our greatest advantages?" "She was always impressive," Marco replied. "I just helped her discover what she was capable of." "And the O'Sullivan problem?" Marco smiled coldly. "Permanently resolved last week." Isabella suggested the approach. It was brilliant. Tony shook his head in admiration. "She really understood the game, didn't she? Better than I expected. Sometimes I wonder if she wasn't born for this." From across the room, Isabella finished a conversation with a senator when her phone vibrated discreetly. It was a message from Marco. "Meeting in 20 minutes, private office." Isabella smiled and discreetly headed for the elevators. In recent months, she had learned that elite social events were frequently used as cover for much more serious business meetings. The private office on the hotel's top floor was occupied by 5 men when Isabella arrived. Marco, Tony, and 3 others she recognized as heads of allied families from New York and Philadelphia. "Gentlemen," Isabella greeted, elegantly removing her diamond earrings and placing them on the table. A signal she had learned indicated that the conversation that would follow had never happened. "Isabella," Marco stood, kissing her hand formally. "Thank you for joining us." In the following months, Isabella had become a valuable advisor to Marco, especially in matters requiring social finesse or political connections. Her transformation from innocent wife to criminal partner had been so complete that sometimes she surprised herself. "What's the situation?" she asked, sitting in the chair Marco had pulled out for her. "The feds are pressing again," explained Vincent Castellano, head of the New York family. "They have a new prosecutor who's making noise about cleaning up New England." "David Morrison," Isabella said immediately. "I know him. He frequents the same social circles as my family. Ambitious, but he has weaknesses." "What kind of weaknesses?" asked Marco. Isabella smiled, and there was something predatory in that smile that would have shocked her parents. He has a gambling problem. He owes more than $200,000 to very unpleasant people in Atlantic City, and his wife doesn't know about the mistress he keeps in an apartment in Back Bay. The men exchanged glances, impressed. "Can you use this information?" asked Castellano. "I can do better than that," Isabella replied. "I can have him transferred to another district. My father has enough influence for that, and Morrison owes me some favors from when I helped his campaign 2 years ago." Marco watched her with a mixture of pride and something that could have been concern. Isabella had adapted to his world better than he had ever expected, but sometimes he wondered if he had created a monster. After the meeting ended and the other men left, Marco and Isabella were alone in the office. "Are you sure you can handle Morrison?" he asked. "I'm sure," Isabella replied, putting her earrings back on. "But Marco, we need to talk about something." "What?" Isabella turned to face him, and there was something in her eyes he couldn't decipher. "I'm pregnant." Marco froze. "What?" "2 months. I wanted to be sure before telling you." Marco approached her slowly as if she were made of glass. "Bella, are you sure you want to bring a child into this world?" Isabella placed her hands on his face. "Marco, this is our world now, and our son or daughter will grow up knowing exactly who they are and where they come from. No lies, no secrets." Marco kissed her then, and Isabella knew her transformation was complete. She was no longer the innocent socialite who had married a humble mechanic. She was Isabella Torino, wife of the head of New England's most powerful criminal family, and she was about to give birth to the next generation of their dynasty. As they left the hotel and got into their armored car, Isabella looked at Boston's lights spreading before them. Her life had become something she could never have imagined. Dangerous, complex, and sometimes morally ambiguous. But it was her life, built on truths instead of lies, and she wouldn't trade it for anything. "Where to now?" asked Marco. Isabella smiled, placing her hand over her still flat belly. "Home. We have a future to plan." And as they drove through Boston's streets, neither of them noticed the discreet car following them at a safe distance, or the photographer with a telephoto lens documenting their every move. Because even in Marco Torino's world, there was always someone watching, always new enemies emerging, and always a price to pay for power. But that's a story for another day.